The encrypted message arrived at 3:47 a.m. on a Sunday morning, sent through communication channels that Charlie Kirk had never used before. Donald Trump was reviewing strategy documents at Mar-a-Lago when his most secure device buzzed with an urgent alert from the young conservative activist who had built Turning Point USA into America's largest student organization. Mr. President, I've discovered something that goes beyond everything we thought we knew about liberal bias in universities. This isn't just about progressive professors or biased curriculum. This is systematic brainwashing on a scale that would make communist regimes jealous. I have evidence of a coordinated program to psychologically reprogram American students, and it's been operating for over 2 decades. The message was unprecedented for multiple reasons. Charlie Kirk had spent over a decade fighting liberal indoctrination on college campuses, exposing biased professors, and building conservative student networks. His battles with university administrators were legendary. His debates with progressive activists had gone viral millions of times, and his organization had documented thousands of examples of anti-conservative bias. But this message suggested something far beyond political bias or ideological prejudice. This was about systematic psychological manipulation designed to fundamentally alter how young Americans thought, felt, and understood reality itself. I need to show you evidence that will explain why an entire generation of Americans seems to hate their own country, why they reject traditional values their parents taught them, and why logical arguments no longer seem to reach them. This isn't natural ideological evolution. This is engineered psychological transformation. Trump stared at the message, recognizing implications that went far beyond campus politics or educational policy. If Kirk had discovered evidence of systematic brainwashing, it would explain patterns Trump had observed but never fully understood. Why young voters seemed immune to economic arguments, why prosperity didn't translate into political support, why patriotic appeals fell flat with college-educated audiences. The proposed meeting location was carefully chosen, a secure conference facility in Phoenix that catered to private business meetings and political strategy sessions. No official records, no university affiliations, no academic oversight. Just 2 conservatives meeting to discuss something that apparently threatened the psychological foundation of American youth. The meeting that revealed America's greatest educational conspiracy. 48 hours later, Trump found himself in a conference room where Charlie Kirk had assembled the most disturbing collection of evidence either man had ever seen. Documents, video recordings, psychological research studies, and internal communications filled multiple tables and covered every wall. This wasn't just about political bias. This was about systematic psychological manipulation that made traditional propaganda look primitive. Kirk looked older than his years, his usual energetic optimism replaced by grim determination that spoke of discoveries that had fundamentally changed his understanding of what conservative students were facing on American campuses. "Mr. President," Kirk began, his voice carrying a weight that transcended his typical activist rhetoric. "What I'm about to show you isn't just liberal bias or progressive indoctrination. This is a coordinated psychological warfare program designed to break down individual thinking and replace it with collective programming." Kirk activated displays that filled the room with evidence that made Trump's blood run cold. Internal university communications discussing cognitive restructuring programs, psychological research studies funded by organizations that officially didn't exist, training materials for professors that read like military counterintelligence manuals rather than educational guides. "They call it comprehensive social integration," Kirk explained, showing Trump program documents that used language he'd never seen in educational contexts. But what they're really doing is systematic psychological deconstruction of individual identity, critical thinking, and cultural attachment. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. While parents thought their children were receiving traditional higher education, Universities had been implementing sophisticated psychological manipulation programs designed to fundamentally alter how students processed information, formed relationships, and understood their place in society. "Look at these training protocols," Kirk said, pointing to instructor manuals that contained techniques borrowed from military psychological operations, cult indoctrination programs, and authoritarian propaganda systems. They're not teaching students what to think. They're teaching them how to think, and the how is designed to make independent thought impossible. But the truth is far more terrifying. The program wasn't limited to classroom instruction or academic curriculum. It was a comprehensive system that controlled every aspect of student experience, from dormitory life to social activities to career counseling. They start with what they call identity deconstruction, Kirk explained, showing Trump's psychological profiles that tracked individual students through their entire college experience. First-year students are systematically separated from their family connections, religious beliefs, and cultural identities through carefully designed social and academic experiences. The deconstruction process was subtle but comprehensive. Students would be assigned to dormitory situations that isolated them from others who shared their background. Course requirements would force them to question fundamental beliefs without providing alternative frameworks for understanding. Social activities would reward behavior that contradicted their upbringing while punishing expressions of traditional values. By the end of their first year, Kirk continued, most students have been psychologically separated from everything that defined them before college. They're confused, emotionally vulnerable, and desperate for new sources of identity and meaning. That's when the reconstruction phase began. Students who had been stripped of their original identities would be offered new frameworks for understanding themselves and the world, frameworks that invariably positioned them as victims of systems they had never questioned, members of oppressed groups they had never identified with, and warriors in struggles they had never chosen. They don't just change students' political opinions, Kirk realized, his voice carrying profound horror at the implications. They change their fundamental psychological structure. They create people who literally cannot think independently because independence itself has been redefined as a form of oppression. The program was so sophisticated that most students never realized they were being manipulated. The changes felt natural, even liberating. Students would genuinely believe they were discovering their true selves, finding their authentic voices, and learning to think critically for the first time. But what they're really learning, Kirk said, is to think collectively. Every independent thought they have has been programmed. Every personal discovery they make has been engineered. They think they're rebelling against authority while actually submitting to the most comprehensive authority system ever created. Trump studied the evidence, recognizing patterns he had observed during his presidency, but never fully understood. "Charlie, are you telling me that universities have been systematically destroying young Americans' ability to think for themselves?" "Not just their ability to think," Kirk replied grimly. "Their desire to think. They've been programmed to find independent thought psychologically uncomfortable, even frightening. What Charlie Kirk discovered will shock every parent. The psychological manipulation wasn't limited to political ideology. It extended to every aspect of human development and social relationships. Students were being programmed not just to hold specific beliefs, but to experience specific emotions, form specific types of relationships, and pursue specific life goals. "Look at these social engineering protocols," Kirk said, showing Trump research data that revealed systematic manipulation of romantic relationships, family connections, and career aspirations. They're not just changing what students believe about politics. They're changing how they love, how they relate to their families, how they understand success and failure. The social engineering was particularly disturbing in its sophistication. Students would be guided into romantic relationships that reinforced their new psychological programming while being encouraged to distance themselves from family members who represented their pre-college identities. Career counseling would steer them toward professions that required continued adherence to the psychological framework they had internalized. Even their personal relationships become tools for maintaining their psychological programming, Kirk realized. They surround themselves with people who reinforce their new identity while cutting ties with anyone who reminds them of who they used to be. But the most shocking discovery was the scope of the program. This wasn't happening at a few progressive universities or liberal arts colleges. It was operating at virtually every major institution of higher education in America. We found evidence of these programs at over 400 universities, Kirk said, showing Trump a map that revealed the true extent of the conspiracy. State schools, private colleges, religious institutions, even universities that market themselves as conservative have been infiltrated. The infiltration had been gradual but systematic. Academic accreditation organizations had been captured and used to impose psychological manipulation requirements under the guise of educational standards. Federal funding had been leveraged to force even resistant institutions to adopt the programs. Faculty hiring practices had been modified to ensure that only professors trained in the manipulation techniques could be employed. They've essentially captured the entire higher education system, Kirk said, and turned it into a factory for producing psychologically manipulated citizens who can't question the system that programmed them. The evidence showed that the program had been operating for over 20 years, processing millions of students through psychological manipulation systems that fundamentally altered their capacity for independent thought and cultural attachment. An entire generation of Americans has been psychologically engineered, Kirk realized, and most of them don't even know it happened. You haven't seen the most disturbing part yet, but the university program was just the beginning. Kirk had discovered evidence that similar psychological manipulation systems were being implemented in high schools, middle schools, and even elementary education programs. They're lowering the age at which psychological deconstruction begins, Kirk explained, showing Trump educational materials that use the same manipulation techniques with younger children. What used to start in college is now beginning in kindergarten. The expansion into younger age groups was particularly sinister because it targeted children before they had developed the cognitive abilities needed to resist psychological manipulation. Elementary school students were being subjected to identity deconstruction techniques that were psychologically traumatic for adults. Look at these curriculum guides, Kirk said, showing Trump educational materials that systematically undermined family authority, religious belief, and cultural identity in children as young as 5 years old. They're teaching children to reject their parents' values, question their family's traditions, and see their cultural heritage as a source of shame rather than pride. The childhood programming was designed to make the university-level manipulation unnecessary. Students who had been psychologically conditioned from kindergarten through high school would arrive at college already prepared for the final phases of psychological transformation. But they're not stopping with the education system, Kirk continued, showing Trump evidence that the same psychological manipulation techniques were being implemented in corporate training programs, military diversity initiatives, and government employee development courses. They're creating a comprehensive system for psychological control of the entire American population, Kirk realized. Education is just the entry point. The corporate programs were particularly sophisticated, using workplace training sessions to reinforce the psychological programming that employees had received during their education. Military programs were designed to break down unit cohesion and individual military identity in favor of collective compliance. Government training was creating a civil service that was psychologically incapable of questioning directives from higher authority. Anyone who goes through American institutions, schools, universities, corporations, military government, gets exposed to the same psychological manipulation systems, Kirk said. By the time they're adults, they've been so thoroughly programmed that they can't even conceive of thinking differently. The alliance that could save American minds. Trump absorbed the implications of Kirk's discoveries, recognizing that this was about more than political competition or cultural conflict. This was about the psychological survival of American civilization itself. "Charlie, what do you need from me?" Trump leaned forward, his face tense. "Charlie, we're in this fight together. But how could something this powerful, this massive, be built without anyone noticing? Who's really behind it?" Kirk hesitated. For the first time, his usual confidence faltered. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, black encrypted drive, placing it on the table between them. "This," he said quietly, "is what keeps me up at night. It's not just universities, Mr. President. This goes much deeper than we thought." Trump narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Charlie's voice dropped to a near whisper. "This drive contains a video, footage that was given to me by a whistleblower. He was a tenured professor who worked on these programs from the inside. Before he disappeared, he managed to get this out." Kirk paused, taking a deep breath. "He told me there's a secret organization behind everything. They call themselves the Architects." Trump's fists clenched. "Architects of what?" Kirk stared directly at him. "Of society itself. Universities are just their laboratory. The real goal is nothing less than redesigning the American mind, and eventually, the world." He inserted the drive into a secure laptop. The screen flickered, revealing grainy surveillance footage of a dark, shadow-filled conference room. 6 figures sat around a long table, their faces obscured by masks and shadows. A distorted voice spoke in a chilling monotone. "Phase 1 is complete. University-level restructuring achieved. Students are now systematically rejecting independent identity." Trump's jaw tightened. "They're openly admitting it, like it's some kind of military operation." Charlie hit pause. "This is worse than a military operation," he said grimly. "Watch what comes next." The video resumed. "Phase 2 begins next year. Early childhood integration. Target age, 5 to 10. By the time they reach college, resistance will be mathematically impossible." Trump slammed his palm on the table, his voice echoing through the secure room. 5 years old? They're targeting children now?" Kirk nodded gravely. "Yes, that's why we have to act fast. Once this phase is complete, an entire generation will grow up never knowing what independent thought even feels like." Trump paced the room, visibly shaken. "This is pure evil, Charlie. But universities alone can't pull this off. Who's funding this? Who's coordinating it?" Kirk opened a thick folder stamped with a single word in bold red letters: Project Unity. "This," Charlie said, sliding it across the table, "is the blueprint. The Architects have infiltrated not just higher education, but corporations, tech companies, social media platforms, even parts of the government. Universities are only the first step." Trump flipped through the documents, his face darkening with each page. There were flowcharts connecting Ivy League schools to federal agencies, secret grant funding from global NGOs, and psychological studies that went far beyond anything ethical or legal. There were even outlines for integrating algorithmic subliminal messaging into social media feeds, subtly shaping what users believed was their own opinion. Kirk's voice trembled with fury. "They're not just programming students anymore, Mr. President. They're building a single unified system where every American will be guided, manipulated, and ultimately controlled without ever realizing it." One document caught Trump's eye: a nationwide map with universities, media companies, and corporate headquarters linked by red lines. At the center was a single black circle labeled simply ARCHITECTSHQ. Trump looked up sharply. "Charlie, this isn't just a cultural war. This is a national security threat." "No, sir," Kirk replied, his voice heavy with determination. "This is a war for the human mind. If Project Unity goes live, free will won't just be endangered, it'll be erased." Trump clenched his fists, his decision crystallizing in that moment. "We're going to show this to the American people. Every parent, every student, every citizen needs to see what's being done to them. But when we release this, they'll come after us with everything they've got." Kirk nodded solemnly. "They'll unleash the universities, the corporations, the media, every institution they've captured. They will try to program the entire nation to see us as the enemy." Trump's voice rose with defiance. "Then we'll use their greatest fear against them, the truth. We'll take this video, these documents, and show them to the world. And when the people see it with their own eyes, no amount of programming will be able to erase it." Charlie leaned forward, his voice steady now. "Mr. President, once we start, there's no going back. They will try to destroy our reputations, our families, even our lives." Trump placed a hand firmly on Kirk's shoulder. "Charlie, sometimes freedom requires risk. Tonight, we stop playing defense. Tonight, we go to war for the minds of the American people." The two men exchanged a final nod of agreement. In that room, an alliance was born, not just to fight for political power, but to fight for the very soul of a generation. "My fellow Americans," Trump announced during a packed rally in Tampa, "today Charlie Kirk and I are going to show you what's really happening to your children in American schools and universities. This isn't about politics. This is about psychological warfare against American families." Simultaneously, Kirk held press conferences at universities across the country, presenting documented evidence of psychological manipulation programs while challenging administrators to deny or defend their practices. The evidence they presented was so comprehensive and disturbing that it couldn't be dismissed as political rhetoric or partisan exaggeration. Internal documents, recorded training sessions, and psychological research studies proved that systematic manipulation was real, widespread, and intentional. The reaction was immediate and intense. Parents who had watched their children return from college as seemingly different people suddenly understood what had happened. Families that had been torn apart by ideological conflicts realized they had been victims of systematic psychological manipulation. But the most significant response came from students themselves. Many who had been through the manipulation programs began recognizing what had been done to them and working to reverse the psychological conditioning they had internalized. The response that proves everything. Educational institutions, corporations, and government agencies reacted to the revelations with coordinated denials and attacks on Kirk and Trump's credibility. Media outlets dismissed the evidence as right-wing conspiracy theories, while academic organizations issued statements defending their psychological programs as progressive education. But the coordinated response actually validated the evidence. The speed and sophistication of the institutional reaction proved that the psychological manipulation programs were real, widespread, and controlled by organizations with significant resources and coordination capabilities. "They just proved we were right," Kirk said during a follow-up press conference. "If these programs didn't exist, they wouldn't need such a coordinated response to deny them." The denial efforts backfired spectacularly as more parents began investigating their children's educational experiences and finding evidence of the manipulation programs. The attempted cover-up generated more attention and credibility for the revelations than the original evidence alone could have achieved. More importantly, the exposure triggered a grassroots movement of parents demanding transparency and control over their children's education. School board meetings became battlegrounds as parents confronted administrators about psychological manipulation programs. University trustees faced pressure to investigate and eliminate indoctrination systems. the choice that will determine America's future. 1 year after their initial revelations, Trump and Kirk faced a decision about how to build on the awareness they had created. The exposure of psychological manipulation programs had awakened millions of parents, but systematic change required more than awareness. It required alternative institutions and educational systems. "We can continue exposing the programs," Kirk explained during their most strategic meeting, "or we can start building replacement systems that actually serve students and families rather than manipulating them." The building approach would require enormous resources and long-term commitment, but it offered the possibility of creating educational institutions that developed independent thinking rather than destroying it. "There's also a third option," Trump said, recognizing implications that went beyond their original alliance. "We could work to reform existing institutions by giving parents and students the power to demand psychological freedom. The reform approach would use legal, political, and economic pressure to force existing institutions to eliminate manipulation programs and restore genuine educational mission." Standing together at a parents' rights rally 2 years after their first meeting, Trump and Kirk represented something unprecedented: successful collaboration between political leadership and grassroots activism to protect American children from systematic psychological manipulation. Their partnership had proven that institutional indoctrination could be exposed and challenged when parents understood what was happening to their children. The psychological manipulation programs hadn't been eliminated, but they were no longer invisible. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that American families could fight back against systems designed to destroy their children's capacity for independent thought. The battle for young Americans' minds was far from over, but at least parents now knew the war was being fought. The most dangerous educational conspiracy in American history had been revealed not through academic research or government investigation, but through the courage of two conservatives who understood that some truths were too important to remain hidden, no matter how powerful the institutions trying to conceal them.